The prairie was silent that morning, the kind of silence that makes a man's heart feel heavy before the sun even breaks the horizon. Wind rolled across the dry grass, whispering through the cottonwoods and pushing a faint dust trail toward the small settlement that sat between the hills and the old cattle road. In that lonely corner of the New Mexico territory, folks still clung to what they called decency, but their kind of decency had no room for weakness. When the people of the nearby Apache village dragged the woman out on a stretcher and left her at the edge of the settlement, no one asked questions. They didn't have to. Everyone could see the truth in her hollow eyes, in the way her legs did not move beneath the old blanket, in the shame that hung on her like torn fabric. She was one of them, an Apache, and now, even her own kind had cast her away. The morning light touched her face as she lay still, her hair tangled with dust, her lips trembling with thirst. The villagers stood far back whispering. Some crossed themselves. Others turned away and muttered about curses, about sins, about the way misfortune followed certain people like a shadow. The blacksmith's wife said the woman must have angered her spirits, that paralysis was a punishment, not a wound. A few of the men wanted to send her away before trouble followed. No one thought of mercy, not until a quiet figure came riding down the road from the east, his hat pulled low and his coat stained from trail dust. He was known around those parts only as the rancher, who kept to himself. His land sat miles from town, a wide stretch of faded grass and broken fences, where he raised a few cattle and spoke little to anyone. He had fought in the war years ago and never spoke of it since. People said he had ghosts in his eyes and hands that worked because they had to, not because they wanted to. That morning, his horse slowed as he saw the crowd gathered by the well. When he noticed the still figure on the ground, something in his chest stirred, something he thought had died long ago. The preacher's boy tried to tell him not to go near her. "She's not right," the boy said. "They say her spirit's broken." The rancher ignored him. He stepped down, boots pressing the dry earth, and walked toward her. The villagers watched in uneasy silence. He knelt beside the woman, his shadow falling over her face. Her eyes opened a little, struggling to focus, but there was fear there, the kind born from too many betrayals. She tried to move her lips, but no words came out. The rancher asked quietly, "Who left her here?" No one answered. Only the wind and the creak of the old water wheel filled the air. When no one spoke, he sighed, lifted her frail body in his arms, and carried her toward his horse. The crowd murmured. "You'll bring ruin on yourself," someone warned. "That woman carries bad luck." But the rancher didn't listen. Maybe he knew what it meant to be unwanted. Maybe he simply didn't care. By the time he rode out of sight, the villagers had already decided they'd seen the last of him. They said no good could come of taking in someone like her, crippled, cast out, cursed. But out on that long road, the woman's faint breathing brushed against his coat, and he wondered what could have driven her people to turn her away. She was light as a child, her wrists scarred, her palms calloused from a life of work. He didn't know yet that the story behind those scars would change both their fates before the next season turned. At the ranch, the air smelled of pine and horses. The rancher's small cabin sat near a line of corral posts and a creek that trickled through the back pasture. He laid her gently on a cot inside and lit a lamp. The warm glow showed her face clearly now, young but marked by struggle. The paralysis had taken her from the waist down, yet her hands trembled as if they were still fighting against something. He brought her water, though she could barely lift the cup. Her eyes followed his movements, uncertain whether to trust him. Days passed before she could speak again. The rancher said little, tending to her wounds, bringing her food, keeping his distance. Each evening he sat outside on the porch, listening to the crickets and the far-off coyotes, wondering why he hadn't taken her to the mission like everyone expected. He told himself it was only pity, but deep down, he felt there was more. Something about the silence between them that spoke louder than words. She began to gesture, to whisper in a faint voice, telling fragments of her story. The words came slow, broken by pain, but he learned enough to know she hadn't been born cursed. She had once been a wife, a mother, and a healer in her village. But when soldiers raided the area months ago, she had thrown herself in front of her child to shield him from gunfire. She lived, but her legs never moved again. The tribe believed the injury meant her spirit was marked, that she had invited death and returned halfway. The medicine man called her presence unbalanced, saying she would draw sickness to others. So in the cruel way of frightened people, they carried her to the border of the settlement and left her with no food, no prayer, no goodbye. As the rancher listened, something hardened in him. He'd seen men lose limbs in the war, seen them crawl through mud just to survive another hour, but he'd never seen a woman left behind by her own. He told her she could stay as long as she wished. She shook her head weakly, saying she didn't want charity. Yet every morning, when the sun broke across the hills, she watched him from the window as he rode out to mend fences and water the herd. She began to ask small favors: threads to mend her torn blanket, a pot to boil herbs. Soon, the cabin no longer felt empty. The rancher noticed her hands working with quiet purpose. She started grinding herbs and mixing them with oil, saying the scent helped with pain. Her voice grew stronger with each day. Sometimes he caught her smiling faintly as she looked toward the open door, feeling the breeze touch her face. The land began to change too. The wild horses started grazing closer to the house, and even the coyotes stopped howling near the stream at night. It was as if her presence, once seen as a curse, brought an unspoken calm to the lonely place. Yet word of her survival spread back to the village. One afternoon, the preacher rode up to the ranch with 2 townsmen. They demanded to know why he kept her there. They warned him that harboring a cast-out Apache woman could bring trouble from both sides: the settlers who distrusted her and the tribes who wanted nothing to do with her. The rancher stood silent as they spoke, then told them to leave his land. The woman heard it all from inside, her eyes wide with fear. That night she begged him to take her away before they burned his ranch for helping her. He only said, "They won't touch what's mine," but trouble was already building. In the coming days, horse tracks appeared near the creek. Fires glowed faintly in the hills, and whispers traveled through the town. Some said the rancher had fallen under her spell. Others claimed she was pretending, that she could walk when no one watched. The preacher's wife swore she saw lights moving near the ranch at midnight. Fear grew, as fear often does from the mouths of the ignorant. Then one evening, while the rancher was out riding fence, smoke rose from the far ridge. He turned his horse fast, knowing the smell too well. It was pine wood and oil. When he reached the cabin, he saw men on horseback circling the yard, shouting, their torches lighting the dry grass. Inside, the paralyzed woman tried to crawl toward the door, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. She wasn't praying for her life anymore. She was praying for his. The wind carried her voice faintly through the smoke as she whispered the only words she had left. That night would decide whether compassion could stand against the cruelty of men who feared what they did not understand. And before the flames touched the cabin's walls, before the mob realized who they were truly burning, the quiet rancher had already made his choice. The fire that night burned hotter than any the rancher had ever seen, its orange glow clawing at the sky like a living thing. He had seen flames devour camps during the war, had watched good men vanish in smoke, but this was different. This was his home, the only quiet piece of land he had ever cared to keep. And inside was the woman everyone wanted gone. The mob's shouts grew louder as they circled the cabin, their torches lighting the dry grass around the corral. The rancher rode fast through the darkness, the pounding of his horse echoing like thunder across the valley. His heart hammered against his ribs not from fear, but from something deeper, a mix of anger and disbelief that the same people who prayed for mercy on Sundays could do such a thing on a quiet night. By the time he reached the cabin, the smoke had thickened and the air was hot enough to sting his lungs. The woman was still inside, crawling across the floor toward the open door, dragging her useless legs through the dirt. Her eyes were wide, tears mixing with soot, but she did not scream. When he burst through the doorway, the sight of her lying there struck him harder than any bullet ever had. Without a word, he wrapped her in a wool blanket, lifted her into his arms, and carried her through the smoke. A bottle shattered near his feet. Someone had thrown a lantern. Flames leapt up, licking the wooden walls. The rancher turned toward the field and ran until the smoke thinned and the shouts faded into the wind. When the night grew quiet again, he stopped by the old creek behind the ridge. The woman's chest rose faintly, her breath shallow but steady. He set her down beside the water and poured handfuls over her face, washing away the soot. Her eyes opened barely and she whispered, asking why he didn't leave her. The rancher looked at her for a long moment before answering, "Because I know what it means to be left." Then he turned his gaze to the distant glow of his burning cabin and said nothing more. By morning, smoke still drifted above the ridge. The town would likely say he got what he deserved for keeping her. They would call it a warning. But deep inside, the rancher knew the fire had lit something that wouldn't burn out easily. The woman, though frail, insisted she didn't want to be a burden. She tried to move her hands, to help somehow, to prove she was still human in a world that refused to see her as one. He told her to rest. She only replied that rest was for those who still had a home. They spent the next few days in an old line shack he had built years ago, while mending fences. It wasn't much. A wooden roof patched with canvas, a cot and a pot for coffee, but it was dry. The woman stayed quiet most of the time, watching him through the dim light as he worked to rebuild what little they had. Sometimes she asked about the war, about why men fought so hard only to return to emptiness. He never had an answer. He told her that once a man's seen enough death, silence starts to feel safer than hope. She began to share more about her past too, speaking softly in the evenings, while the coyotes howled in the distance. She told him of her husband, who had been taken when soldiers raided their camp. She spoke of her child, a little boy who vanished during the chaos. The rancher noticed how her eyes changed when she mentioned the child, like the last bit of light in her heart still burned for him. She said the tribe believed her injury was a curse, a sign that she had invited bad spirits into the village. They said my body was broken because my spirit was unclean, she whispered. But I think they were just afraid of what they couldn't heal. Her words stayed with him long after she fell asleep. In her story, he saw a reflection of his own. He had once been a soldier who came home to nothing, a man who lost his family to sickness and his land to debt. The war had taken his youth. The land had taken his peace. For years he had lived without meaning, only working the ranch because he didn't know what else to do. But now, with her nearby, he found himself waking before dawn not just to tend to cattle, but to gather herbs and wood for her medicine. Her presence made the air feel different, like the land itself was remembering how to breathe. Still, the town did not forget. Whispers followed him whenever he rode in for supplies. The blacksmith avoided his eyes, the preacher refused to speak to him, and some of the ranch hands who used to share a drink with him now crossed the street when they saw him coming. One day, a marshal from the nearby fort stopped him outside the general store. "You're harboring one of them, aren't you?" the marshal said, tightening his gloves. "That woman ain't supposed to be among settlers. You hand her over, and I'll make sure no charges stick for the fire." The rancher looked him straight in the eye and replied, "You'll have to ride through me first." The marshal stared for a long moment, then spat on the dirt and walked away, muttering something about fools who didn't know when to quit. That night, when he told her about it, the woman only nodded. "They fear what they do not understand," she said. "It has always been that way. To them I am not a woman, I am a shadow of something they wish gone." He asked her what she wished for. She hesitated, then whispered, "To walk again. Not to escape, but to stand on my own, even if only once." The days turned to weeks, and the rancher started rebuilding what he could. Together they raised a small shelter by the creek, with walls strong enough to keep out the wind. She began to use her hands again, weaving reeds, grinding herbs, creating salves that helped with her pain. The rancher helped her fashion a wooden brace to keep her upright for a few seconds at a time. Every evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, she tried to stand while he steadied her. Each attempt ended with failure, but she never stopped trying. One evening, a group of riders appeared on the ridge, men from the settlement. They stayed at a distance, watching the small fire near the shack. The rancher felt their presence before he saw them. His horse snorted nervously. He knew they hadn't come for conversation. The woman saw his hand tighten around his rifle, and her voice trembled as she said, "They won't stop, will they?" He shook his head slowly. "Not until they've driven out what scares them most." As the men rode away into the darkness, he wondered how much longer they could live between two worlds, the settlers who despised her and the tribes who had abandoned her. Somewhere deep inside, he knew the fire hadn't been the end. It was only the beginning. There was still something the mob wanted, something they feared she might reveal. Later that night, as the wind howled through the plains, the woman told him the truth about her paralysis. It wasn't only from the wound. She said that the medicine man of her village had cursed her spirit, binding her legs so she could not return to the sacred grounds. He believed her survival had angered the old gods. "He said I was meant to die that day," she whispered. "And when I didn't, he took what life I had left in my body." The rancher didn't know what to believe, but he could see that her pain was real, deeper than bones and flesh. For the first time, he felt a chill run through him that wasn't from the cold. There were nights when he thought he heard whispers near the creek, faint sounds like prayers carried by the wind. The horses grew restless after dark, and sometimes the firewood cracked with no reason. The woman said it was the spirits watching, deciding whether she deserved to live among the living. As the moon rose high over the plains, she lay awake, her eyes open to the ceiling, whispering to someone unseen. The rancher sat outside, sharpening his knife, pretending not to hear. He had seen strange things in his life. Men who survived wounds that should have killed them, dreams that warned of danger before dawn. But this was different. He felt caught between the living and something that didn't belong to either world. Yet despite it all, the next morning she smiled for the first time since he had found her. She said the land had spoken to her in the night, telling her that redemption doesn't always come through walking. It comes through standing for what's right. The rancher didn't answer. He only looked toward the horizon, where faint smoke curled once more in the distance. Someone was watching the ranch again. The wind carried a familiar unease. The same crowd that had burned his home would soon return, and this time they wouldn't come with torches. They'd come with orders. Maybe soldiers. The woman saw it in his eyes before he spoke. "They won't stop," he said quietly. "But neither will we." The days ahead would test everything they both had left, her courage, his faith, and the fragile hope that somewhere between shame and mercy, two broken souls might still find a reason to fight for the right to live. The wind carried the smell of ash across the valley again, faint, but sharp enough to remind the rancher of what he had lost. He could tell something was changing in the air, an unease settling over the land, the kind that comes before trouble. Each morning, when he rode out to check the herd, he found signs that someone had been near the creek. Boot prints in the mud, broken branches, ashes where a small fire had been. Someone was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The woman, though she tried to stay calm, could sense it too. She spent her days weaving reed baskets, her fingers trembling as she worked, pretending not to hear the distant sound of horses on the ridge. The rancher had rebuilt what he could, piece by piece, but the small cabin by the creek wasn't much protection against men with torches or guns. Still, he refused to leave. He told himself it was about justice, about standing against cruelty. But deep down, he knew it was also about her. She had become more than a stranger he saved from the dirt road. She had become the last spark of meaning in a life that had long gone quiet. Yet the more he tried to protect her, the more danger drew near. One afternoon, while fixing a section of broken fence, he saw dust rising on the horizon. Two riders came fast, their horses slick with sweat, their hats pulled low. When they reached the edge of his land, he recognized one of them, the marshal who had warned him before. The other was a man he didn't know, dressed in military gray with a revolver at his hip. "We come peaceful," the marshal said, raising his hand. "Got some questions about that Apache woman you're keeping." The rancher didn't answer right away. He wiped the sweat from his brow, eyes steady. "She's not a prisoner," he said quietly. "She's under my protection," the soldier laughed. "Protection? You call hiding a fugitive protection? That woman's wanted by both the fort and her tribe. The army believes she knows something about the raid that happened last spring." The rancher frowned. He'd heard rumors of an ambush near the old trade route, soldiers killed, supply wagons burned. But he never thought it had anything to do with her. The soldier leaned forward in his saddle. "You hand her over and maybe we forget the fire. Maybe we even help rebuild your ranch." The rancher's voice stayed calm. "If you came here to bargain with threats, you can ride back the way you came." The marshal sighed, clearly torn. "You don't know what you're getting into," he said. "That woman's no ordinary refugee. Word is she was part of a band that turned against her own people. Helped soldiers once, then led them into a trap." The rancher shook his head. "You're saying she betrayed both sides?" The marshal nodded slowly. "That's what makes her dangerous. Everyone wants her gone." After they left, the rancher stood by the creek staring at his reflection in the rippling water. He didn't know what to believe. When he returned to the cabin, the woman was waiting. She could see it in his eyes, that the world had placed new weight on her shoulders. "They came again," she said softly. He nodded. "They think you betrayed both your people and theirs." For a long moment she said nothing. Then her voice broke the silence, low and tired. "Maybe they're not wrong," her words cut through him. She told him that months ago, when the army raided her village, she had been forced to guide them through the hills to save her child. She believed they would spare the tribe if she obeyed, but instead, the soldiers turned on both sides. The men who survived the ambush blamed her, calling her a curse that brought ruin. When she tried to return home, they called her a traitor and cast her out. Her voice trembled as she spoke, and the rancher could see that every word cost her more than breath. It cost her the last bit of dignity she had left. That night, the rancher couldn't sleep. He sat outside, the stars bright above the plains, thinking of the choices that haunt people long after the moment has passed. He knew what it meant to carry guilt, to live with decisions that others never forgive. During the war, he had been ordered to burn a village suspected of harboring outlaws. He followed the command, only to discover later that most inside were innocent settlers. Since then, he had lived like a ghost among men, too ashamed to speak of it. Now, listening to her story, he realized that both of them were prisoners of their own pasts. As the days went by, the pressure around them grew heavier. The town stopped trading with him. Supplies from the store came late, if at all. Once, he found a dead calf by the corral, its throat cut and a sign left on the fence, a crude warning painted in red: "Send her back or burn again." The woman saw it and went silent for hours. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "They'll never stop unless I leave." But the rancher refused. "If you leave now, they win," he said. "They'll learn nothing but hate." Still, she could feel the danger tightening around them. The sound of hooves at night became frequent. Sometimes, strange figures watched from the tree line, then disappeared when he reached for his rifle. The woman began waking from her sleep in a sweat, whispering prayers in her native tongue. One night she told him she saw her child in a dream, standing at the edge of the river calling for her. She took it as a sign that her spirit was meant to move on, but he told her it was just fear trying to play tricks. Deep down, though, he wasn't sure. Then one morning, as dawn broke over the plains, a young boy appeared near the cabin. He was barefoot, dressed in torn clothes, and looked half-starved. When the rancher approached, the boy said he had come from the Apache camp beyond the hills. "They know she's alive," he said in broken English. "They want her back. They say she must answer for what happened." The woman's face turned pale. She asked if her son still lived. The boy shook his head slowly. "No, child. Only anger. The chief says her spirit must be cleansed." The rancher knew what that meant. They weren't coming to talk. They were coming to finish what they had started when they cast her out. For the first time, he saw fear in her eyes, not for herself but for him. "You saved me once," she whispered. "Don't lose your life for what's already lost." He took her hand, rough and trembling. "You're not lost," he said quietly. "Not while I'm still breathing." Over the next few days, he prepared for the worst. He reinforced the cabin walls, gathered food, and hid his horses deep in the canyon. But no amount of wood or iron could hold off what was coming. The woman spent her hours by the fire, mixing herbs, crafting small charms from bone and reed. When he asked what she was doing, she said it was protection, for him, not her. "The spirits listen when the heart is pure," she told him. "Maybe they'll see yours." As twilight settled, a storm rolled across the sky, thunder rumbling like distant drums. The rancher stood by the door, rifle in hand, while she prayed softly inside. The wind tore through the grass, and flashes of lightning lit the valley. For a brief moment, he thought he saw figures moving along the ridge, shadows of riders against the sky. Then they vanished. The woman's voice grew faint, chanting words he couldn't understand. When the storm broke, the cabin fell silent except for the creak of the wooden beams. In the days that followed, the tension became unbearable. Both knew the inevitable was drawing near. The tribe wanted vengeance and the townsfolk wanted her gone. They were caught between two worlds, unwanted by both. The rancher started to notice how she looked at him differently now, grateful but distant, as if preparing herself to say goodbye. One night, she asked him a question that stayed in his mind long after. "If you could take back one thing you've done, would you?" He answered after a long silence, "Maybe not, because even the worst of it brought me here." The woman looked toward the dying fire, her eyes reflecting its light. "Then maybe," she said softly, "our pain is the only truth left in this world." Outside, a coyote cried, a lonely sound that echoed across the valley. The rancher knew it wasn't long now before the world came crashing in on them both. Far away, under the same dark sky, men were already gathering, some wearing blue coats, others painted in red clay, their motives bound by the same thing: fear and revenge. And while the rancher sharpened his knife and checked his rifle, the paralyzed woman whispered to the night that she no longer feared dying. What she feared most was being forgotten again, left alone in the dirt like she once was. The firelight flickered across their faces as the wind began to rise. Somewhere in the distance, a single shot echoed through the hills. It was the sound of a warning, or maybe the beginning of something far worse. The rancher looked toward the darkness beyond the door, his jaw tight. He knew then that by the next sunrise, the line between mercy and survival would be tested in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The night turned colder than usual, and the wind that swept across the valley felt heavy with warning. The rancher barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the echo of that single gunshot rolling down the hills. Somewhere out there, men were gathering, some from the fort, others from the tribe, and all of them were thinking about the woman who now lay inside his cabin, the woman he had sworn to protect. The fire in the hearth had burned down to soft embers, and shadows moved across the walls like restless ghosts. He stood near the window, watching the horizon for the faintest sign of movement, knowing it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing in. The woman woke before dawn, her voice weak but steady. "You should go," she said. "You can still leave before they come." He shook his head, his jaw tight. "If I ride off now, they'll find you before the sun's up. I'd rather face them standing." She looked at him for a long moment, eyes full of something that was not fear but sorrow. "Then they'll take you too," she whispered. He didn't answer, because in truth he didn't care what happened to him anymore. His life had been nothing but silence and loss until she came along. Protecting her gave him something the war, the land, and the world had taken away: purpose. By midday, the storm that had hung over the hills cleared, revealing tracks along the upper ridge. He counted at least 6 horses, maybe more. He knew they were scouts, watching, measuring distance, deciding how to strike. He saddled his horse quietly, checked the rifle, and walked the perimeter of the cabin one last time. The land was too open, too exposed. If they came from both sides, there'd be no escape. Still, he had no plans to run. The woman stayed inside, working on something he didn't understand: a circle of small stones and burned herbs on the floor. The smell filled the cabin, sharp and earthy. When he asked what it was, she said softly, "A prayer for balance, so the spirits know where to stand when the blood starts falling." He didn't argue, though the thought of her expecting blood unsettled him. As he stepped out into the fading afternoon light, she called after him. "If you can't save me, save yourself," she said. He turned back and answered, "I already tried that once. Didn't work." That evening, the first sign of what was coming arrived in the form of smoke, thin trails rising from the far side of the valley, near the old cattle road. The rancher knew it wasn't campfire smoke. It was signal fire, the kind used to mark positions. He could almost feel the circle tightening around them. The horses grew uneasy, snorting and pacing near the corral. He led them down to the creek and set them loose, knowing they'd run far from the gunfire when it began. As he walked back to the cabin, the sun dipped low, casting the land in the deep orange of dying light. Inside, she sat upright on the cot, her hands folded over her lap. Her face was calm, too calm, as if she had already accepted what was about to happen. He poured her a cup of water and sat beside her for a moment, listening to the sound of the wind rattling the shutters. "They're close," he said quietly. "By morning, maybe less." She nodded, then asked, "Do you believe people can be forgiven?" He thought about it, his eyes fixed on the floorboards. "If they can't," he said, "then none of us stand a chance." As darkness fell, he doused the lamp and kept only the faint glow from the hearth. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance. The night was so still that even the trees seemed to hold their breath. Around midnight, the first sound came, a horse's whinny, then the crunch of boots in the dry grass. The rancher gripped his rifle and moved toward the window. He saw silhouettes moving through the moonlight, a dozen at least. Some carried rifles, others torches. At the front rode the marshal, his coat gleaming pale under the moon. Beside him was a tall figure with feathers in his hair, the Apache chief himself. The sight made the rancher's stomach twist. It wasn't just one side coming for her. It was both. He stepped outside before they reached the cabin, his rifle low but ready. The marshal raised a hand. "No need for this to get bloody," he called out. "You hand her over and we'll make it quick. You can walk away." The rancher's voice was firm. "You burned my home? You called her a curse, and now you want to call it mercy?" "I've seen your kind of mercy," the Apache chief spoke next, his voice deep and cold. "That woman broke the bond of our people. She led death to our doors. Her spirit has no place among us or you." The rancher took a step forward, the wind tugging at his coat. "Then maybe it's time someone stood for the ones you both cast aside." The marshal's eyes hardened. "You're a fool," he said. "You're gonna die for a woman who's already dead inside." The rancher didn't flinch. "Maybe that's what it takes to remind the living what they've become." A shot cracked through the silence. No one could tell who fired first, but within seconds the valley erupted in chaos. The rancher dove behind the water trough as bullets splintered the wood around him. The horses screamed and bolted into the night. Smoke from the torches mixed with dust, turning the air thick and bitter. He fired back, his shots echoing against the hills. Men shouted orders, the marshal yelling for the men to push forward while the chief's warriors circled from the flank. Inside the cabin, the woman dragged herself toward the door, pulling her body across the floor with trembling arms. She could hear the gunfire, the shouting, and the crack of wood as bullets struck the walls. Her heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe. She reached the doorframe and saw him, crouched behind the fence, fighting off both sides alone. In that moment, something inside her snapped. Not fear, but the desperate will to stand. She gripped the doorframe, forced her body upright on shaking arms, and tried to push her weight onto her legs. They gave way beneath her, but she didn't stop. She crawled out into the dirt, calling his name, her voice barely audible over the chaos. The rancher turned when he heard her. For a split second, his heart froze. She was in the open, framed by torchlight and smoke. A bullet tore past him and struck the post beside her, splintering wood. He ran toward her, firing as he went. One of the marshal's men fell. Another dropped his torch, setting dry grass ablaze. Flames began spreading fast, feeding on the wind. The Apache chief shouted something in his own tongue, and his men pulled back, unsure if the fire would consume them too. The rancher reached her just as another round of gunfire rang out. He dropped to his knees, pulling her close, shielding her from the flames. "You have to get inside," he yelled, but she shook her head. "No," she whispered, her eyes locked on the burning ridge. "This ends here." She pressed something into his hand, a small bundle wrapped in cloth, the one she had been making from herbs and bone. "For balance," she said weakly. "If they kill me, promise you'll bury this by the creek." Before he could answer, another bullet struck near his foot, sending dust into his eyes. He fired blindly toward the ridge, then dragged her behind the water trough again. The fire grew higher, painting the night sky orange. Smoke rolled through the valley like a dark tide. Men shouted, confused now, unsure whether to fight or flee the spreading flames. The marshal called for retreat, but the chief's warriors kept moving, determined to finish what they had started. The rancher's rifle clicked empty. He reached for his revolver, his last line of defense. Beside him, the woman's breathing had grown shallow, but her eyes were steady. "They'll come again," she whispered. "Even if they burn this land, they'll come until one of us is gone." He looked at her, his throat tight. "Then we'll make sure it's not you." In the distance, the thunder of hooves grew louder. More riders were coming, though whether they were from the fort or the tribe, he couldn't tell. The flames had turned the valley into a furnace of light and shadow. He could feel the heat on his face, smell the dry wood cracking, and hear the hiss of bullets cutting through smoke. Somewhere beyond the fire, the marshal shouted his name, telling him it was over, to hand her over and save himself. But the rancher stayed low, gripping her hand tightly, his eyes searching the burning ridge. He knew this was the final stand, the moment where mercy, revenge, and love all met in the same breath. The woman looked at him, tears streaking her soot-covered face. "If I die tonight," she said softly, "don't let them call me a curse." He brushed the ash from her cheek and whispered, "You're not a curse. You're the only thing worth saving in this whole valley." The flames roared higher, swallowing the horizon. Horses screamed as they broke loose. Men coughed in the smoke, and the air filled with the sound of chaos and fire. Somewhere in that confusion, the first rider broke through the blaze, rifle raised, face hidden by the glare. The rancher steadied his revolver, heart pounding. Behind him, the woman whispered one final prayer to the wind, and for a brief second the night fell silent again, just before the next shot cracked through the firelit dark. The flash from the gun tore through the smoke, and for a heartbeat everything stopped, the fire, the shouting, even the wind. The rancher's ears rang as the world blurred into silence. He dropped low beside her, checking for the wound, afraid to see what the bullet had found. But when she opened her eyes, the relief hit him so hard he nearly forgot to breathe. The shot hadn't struck her. It had hit the ridge behind them, scattering dust into the flames. Then another round came, this time closer, and he turned, firing back until the hammer clicked empty. The air was thick with smoke and fear, both sides lost in the confusion of fire and vengeance. Through the haze, the Apache chief appeared on horseback, his face painted with ash and sorrow. He wasn't shouting anymore, just staring at the woman crawling across the dirt, her body glowing in the flicker of the burning grass. The marshal yelled for his men to fall back, but the chief rode forward slowly, rifle lowered. The firelight danced across his eyes, and the rancher could see that he wasn't just here for revenge. He was here to finish something older than hate. The rancher helped her sit upright, his arm wrapped around her trembling shoulders. "You can't fight them," she whispered. "They've already decided how this ends," but he shook his head. "No one decides that for you." She tried to speak again, but the chief dismounted before she could. His boots crushed the embers as he stepped closer, the rifle slung at his side. For a long moment, no one moved. The crackling fire filled the silence, sparks leaping into the black sky. The chief's eyes softened when he looked at her. No anger now, only grief. "You should have stayed among your own," he said in a low voice. "The spirits do not forgive betrayal." She looked up at him, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "I did what I thought would save my child," she said. "If that's betrayal, then I'll carry it into the next world." The chief hesitated. The firelight showed the doubt behind his hard expression. He raised his rifle, but his hand shook. Before he could decide, the marshal stepped out from behind the fence, his revolver drawn. "Enough of this," he snapped. "She's done more damage alive than dead." He aimed, but the rancher was faster. The shot rang out again, echoing across the valley, and the marshal dropped his gun, falling into the dirt with a groan. The chief's men drew their bows. The soldiers shouted, and chaos erupted once more. The rancher felt the burn of powder in his lungs, but he didn't stop. He pulled the woman behind a fallen beam as arrows whistled past. The fire climbed higher, devouring the cabin walls. The heat was unbearable now, turning the air into a storm of sparks. She clung to him, whispering prayers under her breath, her voice trembling but steady. When the chief's men finally stopped firing, the valley was lit like dawn. Though no sun had risen, out of the smoke came the sound of water rushing, a sudden downpour breaking from the heavens, as if the land itself had decided to end the madness. Rain hit the fire, hissing and steaming as it fought the flames. The remaining men scattered, vanishing into the mist. The rancher stood over her, his coat soaked through, watching as the fire finally died into smoldering ash. The sky cracked open with thunder, and for the first time in months the earth smelled clean again. By morning, the storm had passed. The valley was quiet, the hills veiled in smoke and rain. The rancher moved slowly, his hands blistered from the night before. The woman lay beneath a wool blanket, breathing softly. When her eyes opened, she seemed lighter somehow, tired but unburdened. "They're gone," he said. She nodded faintly. "No," she whispered, "not gone. Just done." He helped her sit up, his voice rough. "You can rest now." She looked out at the valley, the charred grass, the wet ashes, the broken fence, and smiled faintly. "The land always remembers," she said. "But maybe it can forgive too." In the days that followed, they rebuilt what little could be saved. The cabin was gone, but the creek still ran clear. The rancher buried the marshal's revolver beside the water, saying no man should carry it again. He placed her small bundle of herbs, the one she had pressed into his hand, beneath a stone near the same spot. She said it would keep the land balanced, a promise to the spirits that pain would not be wasted. Word spread slowly about the fire and the fight. Some in town said the rancher had gone mad, protecting a woman who brought only death. Others whispered that she had healed him, that the storm itself had come because she prayed. No one knew the truth, and perhaps that was best. The soldiers never returned, and the tribe kept to the far hills. For the first time in years, peace hung over the valley, fragile but real. As the weeks passed, she began to regain strength. Her hands grew steady again, and she could move her legs slightly when he helped her stand. Each day, she walked a little farther between his arms. She would laugh softly when she fell, her voice echoing across the quiet plains. He built her a small garden near the creek, where she planted herbs and wildflowers, saying that even burned land deserved beauty again. One evening, as the sun sank low and turned the sky gold, she sat by the water and asked him, "Do you think we'll be remembered?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe not by name, but the land will remember the ones who stayed when everyone else walked away." She looked toward the horizon, where smoke no longer rose, and nodded. "Then that's enough." When autumn came, the valley began to heal. Grass pushed through the black soil and wild horses returned to drink from the creek. The rancher rebuilt the fence, but he didn't rebuild the house the same way. He left one wall open to the hills, saying he wanted to see the sun rise every morning without a door between him and the world. The woman often sat there, wrapped in her blanket, watching him work. Sometimes she sang softly in her language, songs that spoke of forgiveness and the long road back to peace. One morning, the rancher woke to find her sitting outside before dawn. The mist clung to the grass and the sky glowed faintly pink. She was smiling, her face calm. "It's quiet," she said. "Do you hear it?" He listened. The land was alive with small sounds, the rustle of wind, the creek flowing, the cry of a distant bird. "It sounds like it used to," she whispered. "Before the fire. Before everything." He helped her to her feet, and for the first time she stood without his hands holding her steady, only for a moment, but long enough for both of them to feel what survival truly meant. In that silence, she looked at him and said, "You gave me back what they took." He shook his head gently. "No, you took it back yourself." She smiled, tears in her eyes, and said, "Then we both learned how to live again." That evening, they buried the last of the burned wood near the creek, marking it with stones. The rancher said it was a grave for the past, not just for what had been lost, but for what had been endured. The woman placed her hand on the earth and whispered something he didn't understand. But when she looked up, the wind changed, and he could feel it too, a lightness that hadn't been there before. The years that followed were quiet. Travelers passing through the valley sometimes spoke of a lone rancher who lived with a woman said to have been touched by the spirits. Some said she could heal wounds just by speaking to the wind. Others said she was a ghost. But those who saw them up close knew the truth, that they were simply two souls who had refused to let the world tell them who they were. And when the rancher grew old, he often sat by the creek at sunset, watching the light turn the hills red and gold. The woman would sit beside him, her hand resting in his. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes not. The land around them had changed, but their bond had not. They had both come from ashes, from exile and shame, and somehow built something gentle from it. When the final winter came, the valley lay covered in snow. The rancher passed quietly in his sleep, a faint smile on his face. The woman stayed by his side until spring returned, and when the first wildflowers bloomed, she took the same path he once rode every morning. Some say she vanished into the hills, others that she lay down by the creek and let the earth take her home. But on certain nights, when the wind moves through the grass and the moonlight touches the valley just right, the locals say they can still see a faint glow near the old creek. A man and a woman standing side by side, watching over the land they saved. And if you listen close enough, you might hear her soft voice in the wind, whispering what the land already knows. That love born from pain leaves roots deeper than fire ever could.